People called them the We Can Do It Boys, or Roosevelt's Tree Army, or the $1-a-day boys. Who were the men of the Civilian Conservation Corps? Where were they from? What did they do? They were nearly all young men. How did they feel about it? All of it. The work, the times, each other, the future. My father was one of them. I could have asked him these questions while he was alive, but I didn't. Whom can I ask now? How many of them are left? The Great Depression of the 1930s was many things to many people. To my 2 sets of grandparents, with their total of 12 young children, it was a decade of struggle in the middle of a lifetime of struggle. To my parents, it was the vivid setting of their teenage blossoming. To me, it was the dreamscape of my parents' youth. To the generation after me, it was a Hollywood movie. To economists, it was a problem to be understood. To moralists, it was the payback for the sins of the Jazz Age. To political scientists, a prelude to revolution, fascism, socialism, war, or all of these. To historians and social scientists, a chapter in the story of the emerging American character. To workers, a disaster with obscure sources, a hurricane that people had somehow made worse. 15 million of them were out of work by 1933, including more than half the men under 25. 2 million, including 250,000 teenagers, had hit the road, or the rails, looking to feed themselves. 100,000 businesses and 2,000 banks had shut their doors. 6 billion tons of topsoil were blowing off the land every year. 7/8 of the forests had been cut. For the urban unemployed, there were bread lines, soup kitchens, and political speechifiers. Across the ocean, struggling states were reinventing themselves as militarized totalitarianisms. The young people had their youth, and not a lot more. My father was one of these young people. He had more than most, a good expansive mind and a good expansive heart. He was a city kid through and through, born of immigrant parents who were poor even before their marriage disintegrated. My father was sensitive and street tough both, made good friends, was looked up to by his kid sisters and brother, read all the time, and knew what hunger felt like. His temperament was romantic and idealistic, in spite of the gritty tenement life on Manhattan's East Side. By age 17, he had settled on his life ambition, to be a serious writer. Among the few photos he took in early life are these of his room. There was plenty for anyone to write about, from the Italian invasion of Ethiopia to the great dust storms in the American Southwest. Within a year, the Spanish Civil War erupted, Max Schmeling KO'd Joe Louis, Jesse Owens took the gold at the Berlin Olympics, King Edward VIII abdicated. Closer to home, my father's mother, with her marriage ended, was now dealing with her youngest child's mortal illness. My father, observing everything, was full of a young man's hopes, dreams, desires, and apprehensions too. Some great collective convulsion was coming, and he was poised to take his part in it, to understand it, and maybe to express its meaning in written words. City boys who couldn't find work were flocking into the Civilian Conservation Corps, vanishing into the West for a year or so, and returning full of stories. My father signed up as well, even though he had just fallen in love with a girl he'd met some time before in night high school. He reported to Camp Dix, New Jersey, for training, quickly made new friends, and began sending letters and photos back to the girl. After a few days' training, he was ready to be shipped out west. The adventure had begun. In his first months in office in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt got Congress to launch the Civilian Conservation Corps as part of his New Deal. The C.C.C. had an inevitable logic. It put wasted labor resources together with wasted natural resources. It moved unemployed young men from cities, towns, and failing farms to the countryside to fight forest fires and soil erosion, to build roads, dams, bridges, irrigation projects, trails, and recreational facilities, to aid in pest control and disaster relief, to stock lakes and rivers, to clean up beaches and waterways, to plant trees, over 3 billion in all, which make shade for us today. The program was immensely successful. Every state had C.C.C. camps, situated miles from the nearest towns, each holding a company of about 200, including camps for Native American and African American workers. 3 million men passed through over 2,600 camps between 1933 and 42, in places as separated from each other as Long Island, Alaska, and Hawaii, and every place in between: Michigan, Arizona, Vermont, Puerto Rico, Kentucky, Louisiana, North Carolina, New Mexico, and every other state, including Virginia, where the country's very first camp, Camp Roosevelt, was photographed on the day it opened, April 18, 1933. The Army ran the camps, and the Department of Agriculture and Department of the Interior administered them. Older skilled workers mentored the enrollees, who were paid $1 a day, keeping $5 a month for pocket money while the rest was routed to their families at home. The men were given training and optional classroom courses, were conditioned to work hard, learned to work together, developed skills in a whole array of crafts and methods, including the use of tools and machinery of all kinds, and, for many of the men, the handling of the heavier equipment that would provide them with jobs in their later lives. They were formed into crews and trucked to and from the daily work sites, worked in weather of all kinds, and built things skillfully enough and strongly enough to bear steady use by the public, even into our own time. Enrollees took care of their own barracks, were given free medical care, and were well fed. Camaraderie was high, and most enrollees departed the program with useful skills, self-discipline, and good memories. Their hard work helped them and the nation as a whole survive the darkest years of the Depression, and helped build the recovery of both the economy and the land itself. By the time Congress ended the program in July 1942, a new global struggle had eclipsed the old, and the ex-C.C.C. men were ready yet again to do their part. No man's experience of the C.C.C. is captured by a history or a collective narrative. When my father said goodbye to his Camp Dix friends in August of '36 and headed by train for Idaho, he was beginning a journey at least as spiritual as physical, with meanings only he could have deciphered, colored by dreams and ideas all his own. There were 3 C.C.C. camps in Idaho's Minidoka region. In one of them, B.R. 27, near Rupert, my father joined Company 3236 and made a new set of friends, who were at work rip-rapping local canals and dams. He talked happily in one of his first letters to Josie Greco, the girl back home, of, quote, a chance to sweat in the sun and go to bed with aching muscles, though this kind of heavy work didn't really suit him temperamentally, these photos notwithstanding. He quickly won the job of doctor's assistant and spent his days in the 8-bed infirmary, where he also had his own room, something like this one, with bunk, radio, and books. Young workers found many ways to hurt themselves, and he handled most emergencies himself. In his free time, he hunted antelope and encountered other creatures. Pest control was a company assignment. Here are 300 rabbits killed in a roundup. For leisure, he swam with his friends at the dam or bicycled into Rupert. He had eagerly joined the staff of the camp newspaper and took these photos. Here, in August heat, Jones scores the winning run in a tournament at Pocatello. Captain Sloan makes the announcement that the company team has won the tourney. My father won praise for his writing skills and said in one letter, quote, "Still expect to do big things in that line." Rupert was not New York, but it had sidewalks and ice cream parlors, and places for the young men to, quoting my father, get drunk and raise hell. Naturally, there were local girls, though my father was in this period intensely focused on one girl back home, to whom he wrote letter after letter, sometimes 2 a day, pouring out his ideals, ambitions, insights, and declarations of love. It was unfortunately a one-way flow of passion, and he had plenty of time to think. Here, with a pup he adopted named Sage. Time to ponder the ominous events of the times, the beating of war drums in Europe and the Moscow show trials. Time also to explore the rugged beauty of the world he was in, so different from the cramped world he had come from. Time to brood about the world's hugeness and his own brimming spirit, a spirit too intense, apparently, for the girl back home to understand, much less love. Finally, in mid-October 36, he and others were shipped off to a new camp, taking the long train ride through the countryside, writing in a shaking hand as the train swayed, quote, "The panorama of beauty that glides past the train window. But gosh, how I wish I was with you, even in Central Park."
I knew that the C.C.Cs helped me. I had been out of high school. I was working part-time, could not find a steady job, and I went into the C.C.Cs gladly when I had the opportunity, soon after it was formed. I weighed 98 pounds when I went in, and 10 months later, when I left, I weighed more than 30 pounds more. At that time, the War Department issued us World War I uniforms, and the supply person, who was probably a C.C.C. guy anyway, did not care whether they fit or not. He handed them out, and then we had to adjust the best we could.
We got those wool, 100% wool, 2-piece underwear, long johns, and we got the OD pants, we call them ankle chokers, because you had to take your shoes off, sometimes your socks, in order to get those OD pants on. And they had 2 sizes, either too big or too small.
I, being a youngster, although most of them didn't know that, being all of 115 pounds and 5'7.5" tall, I was a skinny little boy, like the kid on the sand with Atlas kicking the sand in his face. That was me. December came, got cold, the rivers froze, so I spent a lot of time working in the kitchen. So I got fattened up in a hurry.
A fire started just outside of our camp and it crowned out. Now, back in those days, when a fire crowned out, that means it went right up into the trees and just rushes through the trees and it sounds like a freight train. The only thing we could do, as the foreman said, is run like hell and pray for rain.
The summer was almost constantly firefighting. Fighting forest fires is a dangerous job, and people sometimes want to fight forest fires because they think it's something romantic about it, I guess, but it's not.
And then after you get the fire stopped, then you go all around it and cut down all the dead trees or anything that's near for the line you put down to keep fire from spreading over that line. Everything was by hand.
They had a big fire over in Wyoming when C.C. boys got burned up, and I wanted to go. And I went down to sign up, and that guy used to be my teacher, and he says, "You go home and wait 3 more months and then come back."
I graduated from Pasco High School in 1933, and I worked for Rankin's Dairy, and I got $2 a week for 16 hours a day, delivering milk and washing up the equipment and everything else.
I was in a family of 7. My father and the two boys worked for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. They all lost their jobs in the latter part of 1929 and early 30. And all of the four I was the youngest, had to leave home to find an occupation however they could. So we lost, within that year, we could not pay the mortgage on the house. We lost the house. The family had to split, go wherever they could, and the times were very rough for us.
Because many of us, we were in dire straits, I would say. And when you joined the C.C.Cs, I did it because my mother needed the help. We were 10 children, and I was the baby.
In the first years, I knew families in West Texas where I had grown up that they just wouldn't have made it without that. It was wonderful.
I worked on a farm labor, had a dairy, 3 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock at night. And so when I went into CC's, that was a paid vacation.
Of course, I learned how to cut trees and dig holes.
Now they do it with machinery. We used to do it by hand.
I was taught how to use explosives. I was fooling around. I was a young kid, you know. So instead of making a long fuse, I made a short fuse. And they called me Short Fuse Mickey. They would run, I would run too.
Commander would have to authorize a truck service to go to town to walk the streets and do a thing. Hamburger, I think 5 cents, and a Coke. And if you went to a movie, it was 25 cents. Some of the people had dances on a Saturday night. They'd let us go up there and dance, but coming from the farm, I didn't know how to dance, so I got to watch them, and it had a little fun that way.
We had a swimming pool, and every weekend I'd go into Yakima there and haul a load of girls out there. So we was amused pretty good, and we had a lot of fun.
You know, we chased girls like every teenager does, you know. There are quite a few farm girls around Goldendale. One of them still there. She's married to a man that runs our dairy, which she is a real trooper then. And I imagine she still is. I'd like to get back in touch with her because I think she's still alive. Chapter in my life, I guess.
I met my wife up at this camp, this summer camp up at Mount Adams. She was up there with her family and her uncle and aunt. There's 2 or 3 tents with all there, with all the kids and all. I saw her standing there, and I jammed on brakes and slowed down real good and took another look and went on to camp, dropped the boys off and went back. And anyway, we got married in about a month later. We got about 10 or 12 great-grandkids scattered all around.
My dad was in C.C.C. in Vermont. He loved it. He loved being outside. My father was in Weston for 2 years in the Weston camp, and I was conceived there. My parents met on a blind date. And so if it hadn't been for the C.C.Cs, I wouldn't be here.
The best thing that ever happened to me is I met my wife. I met her at a dance 2 weeks before Christmas at American Legion Hall in Orfino, Idaho. And I danced with her more than the guy that brought her. She was working at the Orfino Cafe for 15 cents an hour plus tips and 1 meal. She was a University of Idaho student, and she was trying to earn some money to go back to college. Well, she never made it because she and I got married in June.
For my father, love's journey would not make such a quick and happy story. After 2 days on the train, he arrived in Alturas, California, and then was delivered through the one-store, one-gas-pump town of Likely, where that same store still keeps a C.C.C. album below the counter, to a camp nestled in the dry hills of the Jess Valley along the Pitt River. Here he spent his workdays building fences and reservoirs, with his mind unengaged except for his own thoughts and daydreams. For recreation, there was hiking and swimming in the cold river water. But once winter set in, there was only a weekly in-house movie and endless snow shoveling to distract him from the faltering letter romance with Josie Greco. By mid-December they were quarreling by mail, and by month's end the correspondence had virtually ceased. There were now only local diversions for my disappointed father. The Niles Hotel in Alturas, which had a bar and a dance floor. There is mention in the Alturas Plain Dealer of a dance sponsored by the C.C.C. There was hunting, or more likely pest control. In labeling this photo, my father made it clear that these hunters were not his friends. In contrast with his Camp Minidoka keepsakes, there were no photos of friends from Camp Juniper Flats. This June 37 photo, taken shortly after my father had left the camp, was provided to me by the much older incarnation of this young fellow, Albert Vercruci, who arrived at camp only days after my father had left. This shot that Albert took of retreat formation caught my eye because of the dog. Albert had trouble remembering its name, and then it came to him, Sage. This was the dog that had come with my father from Idaho. Sharing him was as close as he and Albert came to knowing each other, for my father was already on his way back home when this photo was taken. Though he had declared in his letters that he was no believer in fate, the mysterious process of lives crossing each other, almost crossing or never crossing, must have been on my father's mind as he traveled back toward my mother, his hopes hanging by threads. Behind him was an experience and a world which, though beautiful and even glorious, had already begun its fade into the past.
I was a new assistant professor at Cornell University. Madam Frances Perkins came the month after to be a visiting lecturer for a year or so. We became very good friends. She told me how the C.C.C. got started in the cabinet members in the following way. She said, we were all sitting around the table like we usually were, and Franklin said, what are we going to do about these young boys? We have to do something. So he went around to everybody who would speak, and he liked one idea and said, all right, that's a good idea, we'll follow through on that. And you, and you, and you, and you, take care of that, and let me know quickly. And she said, we did.
We felled trees and buck trees and burnt swash in the wintertime.
Then I got the office job it was. They made me water jack. I learned to not volunteer for too much.
The day after payday, there were about 4 people that had money, and everybody else were broke because of the crap game that went on in the men's room.
The money of $5 that I got, I did not spend too unwisely during the month. The $25 that I sent home meant a great deal to my parents.
Oh, they were happy to get the $25 a month. Oh, it was a godsend. We had a family of 8.
25-pound jackhammer, 6 above 0 in shirt sleeves. That's a fact.
Coming out west, going through Montana, I was surprised that so many people had never seen a cow. Only a picture on that can cow, you know. And how excited they were. They just crowd the window. Looky there, there's a whole cow.
I looked out the window and looked close and said, where in the world is the trees and the grass? They said, we don't have it out there. This is desert. I said, well, what's it good for if you ain't got no trees and grass?
I didn't know there was so much expansive room with nobody using it. Because back where I was, we lived in a tenement, and every floor was full of people.
The recruiter wanted to know where we wanted to go. He said, you have a preference? And I was right ahead of my buddy, and I said, yeah. I want to go as far from right here as you can send me. And he looked on a little paper and he said, well, Vancouver, Washington, that's as far as you can go. If you go any further, you'll be in the Pacific Ocean. I said, that's where I want to go. And my buddy said, me too.
This was built in 1936 when the C.C.Cs was formed. And this over here is the glacier itself. And it's receding about 2 feet every year.
I hitchhiked all the way back from Colorado to Yakima by myself, and there was few and far between rides, so I walked most of the way.
And of course the first thing we did is I played baseball in high school,
And so we got a baseball team, so we could compete around there with Bowery and Irwin and Freedom, Wyoming on Sundays.
Our job was to plant trees, and I drove a truck and hauled crews to work, ground a lot of lime that went to the farms.
On the business end of a shovel for a while and worked in the office for a while.
Cutting lake ice for the kitchen and for the field people. And that stuff lasted well through the summer. We had ice cold water, ice cold lemonade, everything.
I had the animals, the mules on my one truck, and we have all the firefighting equipment. We can go as far as the trucks can go, and we unload the mules and the horses and equipment and pack them all on the mules. And a forester would ride that horse and drag those mules up towards the fireplace.
I left school when I was in the 8th grade, and I finished in 3 Cs. You had to do it on your own time. That was the only drawback.
The folks had saved the money that I was earning in the C.C.C for me to go to college on. And actually, I think the C.C.C was the best thing that ever happened.
I did go to college immediately after the C.C.Cs, after 10 months, and never got out.
Well, it was just one happy family. As far as I know, we all got along good and happy and everything.
I stayed there till they wouldn't let me stay any longer.
I got a kick out of being there, and I enjoyed every bit of it. And the food, they bring food in there, you know, and you didn't know what you were going to get, but they made a trip about once a week into town with the truck, and then we'd all go over and see what they brought in.
And we'd sit there, we'd strap a knife onto a stick, and we'd stand on this log, and a fish would swim under it, and we'd spear them. And every Sunday down at the mess hall, we had fish fry. I don't think there's a game warden around here. I hope not, anyway.
1231, eastern part of Oregon. Got there in January, so that's why I slept next to the stove.
1935 to the spring of 1936. That makes me an old guy.
1295, Redding, California, working on the Shasta Dam project with Bureau of Reclamation there.
But it was a good experience. Good experience.
Enjoyed it, and I think the best thing that ever happened.
And they were a good bunch of guys. I mean, there's nothing that they wouldn't do for you, you know what I mean? And we watched out for each other, and we learned how to work.
Most of the other guys all went back into the Army, went to war, and I stayed on the farm, raised the food for them.
Meeting people from all other parts of the country, that was the greatest part of it. And they tell you about their lives like we're talking here, different parts of the country, where they came from, where they went to school.
I have 5 report cards from 2nd grade because my father was setting up the educational programs in the camps in Texas. I could remember the boys building all those buildings out of rock. It was really something. It was fun. They were great years.
One of the things that the C.C.Cs did for me, it made me very strong. Made me very, very strong. It was a good lesson for me for the rest of my life. Words really can't describe it. It was a new life for me. I remembered that all my life.
You had a chance to see the country for free. They paid you for it. And it was really a wonderful adventure.
It was the greatest thing that ever happened in this country, in my opinion, because it gave these people something to do, some direction. It gave them a job. It kept them out of trouble. When you take a couple of hundred boys, from 17 to 21, 40 miles from town, what are they going to do?
And in the C.C.Cs, I had one awful good time, and I learned a lot of things that I had to have to make a living.
Well, you know, I think that they didn't pay any attention to their father or grandfather when he was trying to tell them about his C.C.Cs. And all of a sudden, after they're gone, they said, well, he was in the C.C.Cs, and now they're talking about that, and I'd like to know something about it. But it's too late. In most cases, it's too late.
I want to tell you, the C.C.Cs gave this guy a real chance, just like he did thousands of kids all over the country.
I learned discipline. I learned to work and do a good job. And I learned fellowship. It was enjoyable. Hard work, but so enjoyable.
To me, an expedition into the past is worth some real persistence, as long as what I'm after is truly personal. My father never did become a writer, though he did win my mother's love when their lives crossed again quite by chance, some years after his great heartbreak and after the Great Depression was a memory. But who was the earlier version of him? And what did he once feel that he never spoke about in his mature life, but that you could hear in his tone whenever he began a sentence with, "When I was in the seas"? What was that haunting sound of a beauty bygone and lost? Lost except in the letters sent to that girl back home, who saved them long after he himself had gone back into the earth. Did his young comrades in the barracks dream about the future just as he did? And did the unfolding of their actual lives reveal its necessary logic to them once they were old men looking back? And is that why they're so light-hearted about past and present? Still, we, their children and grandchildren, want to know things. How did their world turn into the one we're in, and their lives yield our lives, and the meaning they saw recede into the meaning we see? How do the struggles of their time teach us to face the struggles of our own? So often, the lost part of people, including ourselves, is the most beautiful part. That's why quests like this one are the opposite of somber. If anything, they're fun. Will there be an old man who remembers our young father, doing something or saying something, or getting into some mischief? Will there be a photo somewhere that froze a moment of his being? Even if not, the spirit of what we're looking for is still there in the people we meet on the way. What was true then is still true now.
Well, this is all there is left now. There's a bunch of stones, a lot of stones. And I have maps and this and that, but actually, even trying very hard, there's no way to know what building was where, and where the flagpole was, and where the infirmary was, and where the barracks were, and where the gate was. It's all very flattened out, and that's the feeling, too.
There were a lot of people here once, and a lot of people had a very good time, very interesting time. Maybe a hard time for some. And that's all gone, and they are all gone, and probably the few who are left will be gone too. What we have left now is monuments, plaques, museums, artifacts, written words. We have the task of making a meaning from them. Occasionally, the museums come to life. The C.C.C. men and their families still gather now and then, still try to match the world they lived in to the one they see abstracted. Each reunion dwindles in size noticeably. But the old-timers go on swapping stories and recalling long-vanished people who remain not just alive, but full of life and personality in memory. Between museums are immense stretches of country, so immense that it's hard to imagine the scale of hardship people lived through here a not-so-long time ago. But that is the challenge, at least for those who like to know why things are and what our world came out of. For those who like to go beyond the images bequeathed us, to go past the cliches of movies and school books, and try to feel something that isn't there anymore. Something important and worth feeling. That's where the C.C.C. men and their testimony is particularly precious. They were there during the drought and the dust storms. They were there when people broke their bodies working the land. When young people worked hard just to eat. When children saw the harshest realities of life and death. When people stuck together and helped each other. Because they had to and wanted to. The C.C.C. men were there for the 10 years of hard times that hit everyone a different way, though it did hit everyone. The farmers who were used to struggles and disappointments, but not on this scale. The small townsfolk whose options were always narrower than the big city people. The urban masses whose difficulties and worries were often masked by their great numbers, or by the glitter of the wealthy ones walking the same sidewalks with them. The young and the very young, who took the world bluntly as they discovered it, and made the most of it. 10 years is a long time. What else did the C.C.C. men do for the country in those years, besides all the planting and building and firefighting? They turned out in force to help when disaster struck, as in the flood of the Ohio River in '37, the New England hurricane of '38, the floods in Vermont and in New York in '37, the blizzards in Utah in the '36-'37 winter. Bad luck befell them too sometimes. Their work projects were nearly always labor-intensive and were sometimes perilous for inexperienced young men. During the Labor Day hurricane of '35 in the Florida Keys, 44 C.C.C. men died. Other C.C.C. men died fighting forest fires, including 10 who perished in the infamous Blackwater Fire in Wyoming in 1937. There were logging accidents, drownings, and other camp-related misfortunes recorded year by year. And there were freight car hopping accidents, even though the railroads allowed C.C.C. men to ride legitimately for just a penny a mile. Young men do what young men do, and there were, after all, over 3 million enrollees, mostly young. Only the Army could recruit, equip, and transport such large numbers of men efficiently. And so the Army was given the job of setting up and managing the camps. But the C.C.C. men were civilians, and there was no saluting or drilling or MPs or guardhouses or weapons training. In the field, on their work details, they were supervised by Forest Service or National Park Service staff. They did all this while some of the economically beleaguered nations overseas were imploding and presenting to their working people, and especially to their young people, reinvented societies far different from the traditional ideal in America, where children, whether hungry or well-fed, played their own games and went to school with fairly light hearts and heads full of the imaginary fun of big-screen favorites like Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland, and the Dead End Kids, where there were no secret police or armed battalions on the streets, but just people living their lives, going to and from work, trying to keep up with their rents, where people did their showy steps on dance floors in town halls to the upbeat music of big bands, or to country music in school auditoriums, or to Latin orchestras in clubs, and not down the avenues with jackboots and helmets and fixed bayonets, and where work, even if hard to get for some, was simply work and not forced labor. As these new totalitarian states simmered and bubbled toward the full rage of war, Americans watched newsreels and listened on the radio. They had their fears and hopes, and took their sides, sometimes egregiously. But the deepest wish was that it would all go away, or that we might simply stay out of it until it burned itself out, or evolved into something tolerable. The atrocities committed by the fascists and by the Japanese military upon their weaker neighbors angered and frightened everyone, including the young men working in the forests and parks. The start of the war between Britain, France, and the Axis in September 1939, the fall of France in June 1940, the 1940-41 Blitz against English cities, the first peacetime draft in this country's history in September 41. All of this sat uneasily in the minds of the young C.C.C. men, who knew full well that they must do the soldiering, if it came to that. And it did come to that. And the C.C.C. men signed up, or were conscripted, and changed one uniform for another. They fought in every theater and every campaign of the war, alongside men who had never worn any uniform nor been anywhere far from home. When it was over, they came back, or at least the great majority did. They put war memories behind them and began building lives in the world that slowly became recognizable to us, our world, the world of relative stability and prosperity and comfort. The former C.C.C. men went to work, changed as the world changed, raised families, saw the older generation pass, grew old themselves, dealt with the inevitable losses.
I was 22. My wife was 20, and she passed away here in '84.
Yeah, well, we were married 67 years.
Last December 3rd last year, she died.
Most are still grateful to the C.C.C. for the good it did them.
But it was a good life for us at the time, because we didn't have no job and no money, and that way we got 3 meals a day and clothing and such as that.
I'm 85 years old, and I'm just as strong as can be. Camp life, so over 7 years in camp, that's what made me healthy and strong. I always wanted my body to be that way.
Got off the train in 55 below zero that morning, so it was quite cold.
I did not look forward to planting trees. So I can honestly say I have never planted a tree.
They are old now, but the vanished world of the Great Depression is still in them, not just in their memories, which are fading, but in their sensibility, their humor, their attitudes toward what the world turned into, their postures toward both life and death. Some of the men have passed since they spoke before the camera. Others have simply gotten older. These are the living links between one age and another. Nothing is very far removed from anything else, and each of us carries around inside us a piece of all the others we've ever encountered. The history we write is just our way of gathering the pieces while they are still there. Because when the last of these embers burn out, that's when an age is truly gone. The young men of the C.C.C. did their work and lived their daily lives just as young men do today, alert, good-humored, curious about the world they are facing as new adults. What sort of world was it? In the same month as the C.C.C. was launched, April 1933, Mount Rushmore was dedicated, the movie King Kong was released, and the first concentration camp was completed in Dachau, Germany. These were the sort of elements that 18-year-olds had to make a coherence out of. The information media, then as now, mixed important news coverage with sensational items. Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly, the Barrow Gang, and the repeal of Prohibition got as much attention as the dust storms, the banks, the government, the foreign conflicts, and the 15 million unemployed. In 1934, more fresh enrollees faced the same sort of dissonance. Chancellor Hitler became Germany's dictator, the dust storms worsened, last year's gangsters, and John Dillinger as well, were gunned down. Flash Gordon, Lil Abner, and Donald Duck made their debuts. And so it went, a big mixed bag, as the Depression ground along and the nation tried to transition from the past order to the one that was to come. In 1935, Bruno Hauptmann was sentenced to death for the Lindbergh baby kidnapping and murder. The world's first television program was broadcast in Berlin. Babe Ruth played in his last game. The Social Security Act became law. Will Rogers and Wiley Post died in a plane crash. T.E. Lawrence in a road crash. And Huey Long by an assassin's bullet. Thomas Wolfe wrote Of Time and the River. James Hilton wrote Goodbye, Mr. Chips. The next year, Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind topped the bestseller list. It was an election year, and President Roosevelt, campaigning for a second term, proposed a drastic cut in C.C.C. funding in order to present a balanced budget to Congress. A howl of protest went up from every side, Republican as well as Democratic. The C.C.C. was the one inarguable success of all the New Deal programs, though there had been some resistance to it at first from labor leaders who feared it might take away jobs from employed workers, and from local politicians who feared that a sudden large influx of young men from somewhere far away might cause social or economic problems. The opposite turned out to be the case. By 1936, C.C.C. camps were welcomed nearly everywhere. They actually stimulated local economies, since the barracks were constructed by local labor, and the camp residents were fed from local farms and suppliers, and the recruits spent their money in the local towns. More than that, the C.C.C. men did improvement work that benefited the farmers and ranchers and residents of the region. For their firefighting work alone, they were regarded gratefully by the locals. Beyond that, they undertook large irrigation and water control projects, restored the eroded landscape, fought pests of many kinds on a large scale, and much more. They got along with the townspeople, and often wound up marrying local women and settling down to raise families as part of the communities near the camps. Incidents of mischief or more serious conflicts with the local people are isolated and uncommon in the C.C.C. records. The year 1937 brought more news, good and bad. The United Auto Workers won a sit-down strike against General Motors, while the number of unemployed reached 17 million. Most of the new crop of C.C.C. recruits had been infants or not yet born when World War I had ended with the Treaty of Versailles, nowadays blamed for much of the anger and the economic distress which provoked the rise of militarism, fascism, and governments eager to make new wars. The young C.C.C. enrollees shouldered their picks and shovels while yet another turbulent year unfolded. In Spain, American volunteers in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades had joined the fight against General Franco. At home, the Hindenburg exploded and burned. Batman and Disney's Snow White made their first appearances. Of Mice and Men and To Have and Have Not were published. Gehrig, DiMaggio, Ott and Fox were the baseball gods. Babe Diedrichson, Bobby Jones, and Buster Crabbe made headlines. Amelia Earhart disappeared. Meanwhile, Stalin's Great Purge was underway, and the Japanese slaughtered 300,000 civilians in Nanking. The following year, the whole world lurched toward war, despite the Munich Conference and the Peace for Our Time Declaration. The Germans continued building concentration camps, legally oppressing minorities and pushing troops into neighboring territory. Japan expanded its war in China. Roosevelt called for American rearmament. The first Superman comic book appeared, and The Good Earth, Topper, Lost Horizon, and Heidi were box office hits. 1 O'Clock Jump and They Can't Take That Away From Me were on the hit parade. For the young men of the C.C.C., the world that they had more or less just arrived in was ripe for a violent convulsion. The recruits read the papers and watched the newsreels and listened to Edward R. Murrow and the president's fireside chats on the radio. They made what they could of what was happening. In their letters home, they traded worried and confused sentiments with parents and siblings in the cities and farms back east or south or north. Giants were now wrestling over everyone's heads, and the biggest giant of all, the Depression, was still there, throwing its massive weight around. John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, topping the bestseller list, captured a part of the people's suffering and heroism. Kate Smith's God Bless America had become a popular anthem. Finally, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the great catastrophe befell, the one that would cost 60 million people their lives. For 2.25 more years, the young C.C.C. enrollees labored, rested, and played in their rural camps. As the war news came in, bad news for those opposed to the Axis powers: the collapse of France, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Finally, military conscription began here, and enrollments in the C.C.C. fell off as work became available, work supplying food and materiel for the warring nations abroad. After December 7, 1941, the C.C.C. men would be supplying their own lives into the fray. Meanwhile, they kept working, building roads, planting trees, putting out fires. Their numbers at the same time dwindled by more than 2/3. Finally, in mid-1942, Congress voted to liquidate the program. The great government-sponsored conservation initiative was over. What had the C.C.C. men accomplished? They had built 97,000 miles of fire roads, built almost 3,500 fire towers, helped develop over 84 million acres of agricultural land. They had repaired soil erosion on over 20 million acres, had given over 4 million man-days to firefighting, and planted more than 3 billion new trees. But these are numbers, and the real legacy is harder to calculate. The men did wildlife protection projects and disease control projects and large-scale disaster relief projects. They built campgrounds, hiking trails, picnic shelters, swimming pools, fireplaces, and restrooms in public parks across the country. Most of all, they built work skills, friendships, and selves that were stronger, more useful, and finer than what had been there before. As with everything in our lives, the true space occupied by an experience can only be understood after decades have passed. The C.C.C. men kept a memento or two, a few photos, a uniform cap, a certificate. In the repeated pattern of all generations, they spoke more often of their youthful exploits when they were still young. then less often as the memories faded, and finally not at all, as there was no one to really listen, no one who had shared that time in history and could understand. Mementos got put away and forgotten, and often thrown away once the men passed on. The Great Depression became something that high school students read about in textbooks, or saw presented as a cliché in movies. But for anyone who does seem to want to know what it felt like to be there, the surviving C.C.C. veterans pull those mementos right out and spill out their stories, which, wonderful or tragic, all seem to have one positive theme. Maybe old age erases all bad memories. Or maybe it's simply true that, as the old-timers of the Civilian Conservation Corps put it time after time, it was the best thing that ever happened.
You know, I gave him $10 not to sing, and he gave it back to me.